my officers in the ministry. So members of the public may not know, but the Ministry of Legal Affairs is pretty wide. So under our umbrella, we have ministry headquarters and Department of Public Prosecutions, chambers, DCFS, court services, NDC, the judiciary, the mirrors program, legal aid, liquor licensing, and newly acquired social services. And our officers have been working tirelessly during the COVID pandemic to make sure that our operations remain stabilized. So I'd like to just give a shout out to my officers to say, well done. And I'm really proud of what we've managed to deliver during this period.
Now, you mentioned the newly acquired division that's falling under your ministry. How will that impact your overall ministry?
Well, right now we have departments that basically provide the social service framework for the country. So Department of Child and Family Services provides services for our families, children and adults. And we also have court services who deal with a whole different demographic. So social services was an interesting addition to our portfolio, but not necessarily not aligned. And so we actually have an archaic social welfare act from 1971, which I'm reviewing. And what we're going to endeavor to do is create a framework for social services for the country and feed in all of the different demographics that fall under that head to make sure that our people are properly supported when it comes to their social welfare. So we'll be reaching out to address the homeless issue. We'll continue to service our families, but it's a welcome addition, which allows us to expand our framework and make sure that we're adequately progressive in this post-COVID period to address the challenges that arise with regard to the social issues in the country.
You mentioned that aspects of how we have been operating, we're still operating in, to a certain degree under an archaic system. Can you give us a clearer idea of what you mean by that?
When I say archaic, we have a lot of processes that need to be modernized in our business models. So we have a paper society, and I know the Premier is anxious to make sure that we modernize that aspect of our operations so that we're more technologically savvy. And so we have a file-based system, a paper system generally. The world has moved on, and the civil service that supports the government's mandate has to be more nimble and flexible and able to address the modern post-COVID world. But generally what we do during this period is to look at our processes and our business model to make sure that it's flexible enough to deal with the new normal, whatever that new normal turns out to be. So the Premier has made it quite clear that basically COVID has forced us to now operate with a blank slate. And so we actually get to create what Bermuda looks like. And in that vein, I'm actually sitting down with my team to determine what the services we offer look like. So before COVID, just before COVID, the ministry had embarked upon some social, I shouldn't say social, strategic planning. And it was very interesting to see what came out of that. So we had one meeting, it was a great meeting. And the report back was that there are overlaps in services. In some cases, the different departments weren't as aware of what each other were doing. So it's a perfect opportunity for us to really drill down and make sure that we come up with a business model that is sustainable and properly reflects the needs of the country going forward.
And for those of you who are just joining us with our Facebook Live, the Attorney General and Minister of Legal Affairs, Senator the Honorable Kathy Lynn Simmons, JP, we welcome you to send in a remark in the comment section of the Government of Bermuda Facebook page. Any questions or comments that you have, now is your opportunity to join in on this discussion. What are some of the key things that folks need to be aware of right now? I know recently you made a pretty important announcement regarding cannabis. Let's touch on that. There are a number of issues that we can touch on this evening, but I know a lot of folks have been wondering what was happening with that regime.
Well, I've made several public statements with regard to our new regulated cannabis scheme, and it's a proposal that has been put on the government portal for the public to weigh in and give their input. Historically, I shouldn't say historically, but recently, the public will recall that we started along this journey from a throne speech initiative, which was designed to address medicinal cannabis, the cultivation of it, etc. And from that exercise of policy development, I really felt that we weren't hitting the mark when it came to the economic opportunities that we hope to afford our citizens through that vehicle. So we decided to delve deeper into the policy and to look at cannabis differently and from a wider perspective. And out of that exercise came the initiative to provide a regulatory and licensing scheme for cannabis generally in Bermuda. So members of the public will know that we've produced a policy paper and some illustrated draft legislation to support what we call a regulated cannabis market. And I can honestly say, Sherry, my phone has been ringing off the hook since we posted those documents. And so you see the energy around this initiative when it comes to economic empowerment, but the different demographics who are interested in this initiative span from religious communities to business people to disenfranchised young people who see this as an opportunity for economic empowerment otherwise, and basically just people who are looking for an opportunity in this post-COVID contracted economy. So what we're doing at this juncture is making sure the public understand where we're going. There are different licenses that can be obtained from a cultivation license for commercial purposes. We have export licenses, import licenses. I mean, the whole gamut, which you can find on the portal. And I'm not going to go into detail because the object of the exercise is for Bermuda to earn this initiative. And so I encourage members of the public to weigh in, to give your input, because the end result is something that we must create together. The object is for economic empowerment, but also around this whole subject matter, there are other initiatives that the government is undertaking to ensure that we have some semblance of social justice in the country. So persons will be aware of the expungement of convictions for persons who have been convicted for possession of 7 grams or less. I'm happy to say that that proposal has been supported by the cabinet, and the draft legislation should make its way to the Senate very shortly. And building on that, I would expect that once various activities around cannabis are no longer criminalized, we will look to expand the expungement of related convictions in due course. And so it's a win-win for everybody. And what it does is give people a chance to do something different, give people a chance to see an economic empowerment light at the end of a tunnel, which at most times can seem quite dark, particularly in this environment. And so we once again encourage people to weigh in. Please don't call me. Please don't email me. You have an opportunity to add your voice to the actual process. So I need to make clear that the legislation is going to change as we go along. So this is not an exercise that's going to be prolonged. We have an illustrated draft bill. It's not perfect, but it does set out the framework for people to have a look at. We've had comments that we're embracing, but along the way, we intend to change the legislation so that we have a shorter turnaround time and completion time after the end of consultation, which is July 2nd. So please weigh in. It's a very simple process. Your questions will be answered, but this is your opportunity to shape cannabis in Bermuda.
You mentioned, Attorney General, that one of the key objectives of this expanded regime is to provide a form of economic empowerment for those in the community who historically haven't had these types of opportunities. One of the concerns that is consistently voiced out in the community is that the only people that can afford to start businesses are people who are already in a position to run business. Namely, folks like the oligarchy and Front Street and people who historically have access to capital. There is a concern that even though the intention is to aim it at people who have been disadvantaged financially, at the end of the day, that might not end up to be the case.
So, Sherry, if people look at the proposal, there are various classes of licenses that are available for various types of activity. So a cultivation license for commercial purposes can be a huge enterprise. It could be a small enterprise. There's an opportunity for people to have an import license. So you may want to import edibles and different products to sell for retail. So we go large, we go small. The intention is not to have the market monopolized. The intention is to make sure in granting the licenses that we achieve the balance that we want to achieve. We have scientific and medicinal component, which of course is an extremely specialized area. So we may see some inward investment from larger groups. But when it comes to the retail, when it comes to the commercial cultivation, and I will say that the initial proposal did have a personal cultivation license, and that was very popular. And we took it out of the proposal for the time being because there are issues concerning enforcement that really presented a hard nut to crack on the front end. But I will say, Sharon, I'm going to digress for a minute. Underpinning this whole exercise is obviously public health concerns, public health concerns. And what we're trying to do is create a regulated regime that offers certain protections. So alongside this regime will come a massive public education campaign. And so, for instance, with the personal cultivation license, say we allow people to import 3 plants for their personal use. Yeah, we weren't trying to do enforcement. We're behind your fence every night to see if the 3 turn into 150. So what we're promoting is personal responsibility. Personal responsibility. So in loosening the range, we expect people to use the regime wisely to advance their economic interests, but also to make sure that they ensure that the safety aspect of it, the health aspect of it is actually preserved and given credence to in this whole exercise.
All righty, we have a number of, thank you, AG. We have a number of questions that are coming in via Facebook. Let's go to some of the questions. Will people be able to grow a small amount for themselves? And understanding that you said that this is evolving, will eventually people be able to grow a small amount for themselves?
And so that question pivots back to the personal cultivation license that I just spoke of. And as I said, that was in the original scheme. What I need people to do who feel passionate about the personal cultivation license, remember, that's not for commercial purposes, it's for your personal use. Please write in and support that initiative, and it may find its way back. Yeah, we initially had a proposal where persons who obtained licenses for personal cultivation could not have children under the age of 16 living in the house. And that was our attempt to balance the public health concerns in relation to young people with the need for, or the permissions for persons to grow small amounts of cannabis for their own personal use. It is a possibility that that license may rear its head once more, but this is where public input comes in. So if there's a huge impetus or movement to have that license put back into the proposed scheme, then people need to speak up. So this is not a situation where you just call in and you email and you voice your concerns around the kitchen table. I actually need people to feed in the wishes and desires for this scheme on the portal.
Now let's get quickly back to some of the questions that are coming in via our Facebook page. Once consultation is over, how long do you foresee it to be tabled in the House of Assembly?
Well, we're looking to try and table something at the end of July, and that's subject to how the scheme expands. I mean, cannabis has been on the cards for quite some time now. The Premier is anxious for us to bring this to fruition, and so we, to the extent that it will provide some economic activity. Persons will know that the scheme requires an advisory authority to be set up that's staffed with specialists and some members of the public. And so we're going to try to make some inroads in doing some of the prep work with regard to the administrative framework. So we're looking for a fairly rapid turnaround, but of course that's going to depend on the feed-in that we get from the public and what the end result looks like. But this is not a process that we intend to lengthen, but understand that it does have to make its way through both houses of the legislature. So we're going to do our best to respond to the public desire to have this regime in place as soon as possible.
A number of questions coming in on the subject of cannabis. Can a person or company apply for 2 cannabis licenses? For example, if someone wanted to cultivate and have a retail store as well.
That's not something that is precluded or prevented in this scheme. For example, if you have a retail license, with that will come an import license. Yeah. And so what you do is you make your application, and the application will set out what your business plan is in a nutshell, and the corresponding licenses to support that business can be applied for.
Another question, when it comes to providing licenses to growers for medical cannabis, will there be people able to get a legalized source of seeds?
Yes.
This question, the Premier has said that he is tabling new legislation to address systemic racism. We already have a Human Rights Act. Does government intend to amend the Human Rights Act to specifically address systemic discrimination and empower tribunals to make orders to address this problem?
We have not approved any scheme that has those components. With regard to systemic racism, we actually have a law reform commission that is, let me be clear on this one. The issue of systemic racism and other very, what's the word? Complex issues for the country deserve real study. It's very easy to throw so-called simple solutions at wider problems, and the problems that in fact will create systemic racism may not be solvable by legislation alone. So when we say systemic, it suggests a wider insidious reach than what we consider at face value. So all that to say, we have a law reform commission, and members of the public are invited to send in submissions for projects that they would like to see undertaken by the commission. The commission is going to be meeting the week of June 15th. And if you look at the Law Reform Commission Act 2009, they do take public submissions. They do, of their own volition, take up different subjects to study, and the government, of course, can refer things to the Law Reform Commission. But under systemic racism, you may find that we need to get on in short order with workforce equity and other initiatives that are historic to the Progressive Labor Party government. And I was sent by one of my colleagues, Ralph Commission, recently, a workforce equity draft bill from 2007. And so in this present climate, I think that the will of the government would be to be looking at this very closely. So I would suggest that members of the public who are interested in this particular area of law reform, that they make their voices heard and submit proposals to the Law Reform Commission. And the email address for the Law Reform Commission is lawreformcommission@gov.bm. But yes, the government will be doing its very best to address that.
Next question. Many of us are confused as to why the laws haven't been changed from criminal offenses, thus preventing people from getting on the stop list.
So say that again, Sherry. Can you read that again?
Many of us are confused as to why the laws haven't been changed from criminal offenses, thus preventing people from getting on the stop list. And I am assuming, and certainly the person who sent this question, and you can clarify this, but I'm assuming they are speaking in relations to persons who may have been convicted for simple possession, et cetera, for cannabis.
Okay, so those convictions will be expunged. Simple possession of 7 grams and under has been already accounted for. So when they say the law is being changed to decriminalize certain offenses, we'd have to get a lot more specific than that. Understanding that the stop list, the US stop list, is not controlled by this government. So in our effort to assist the decriminalization of particularly our young Black men, we are ensuring that for instance, if you look at the cannabis scheme, what we've tried to avoid are criminal penalties. And so some penalties are civil, but as we work our way through to finalizing the scheme, we're actually going to have that in mind. The disadvantages that come with criminalization, but understand that this is a two-way street and the government can't always undo what is done. And so when I talk about personal responsibility, persons need to play their part in ensuring that they're not on the stop list. But we're making every effort to address the systemic and historic injustices in the best way we can through our legislative initiatives, always mindful of the need to give that focus.
Still on the subject of cannabis, how does the government intend to test drivers for driving while impaired when they are under the influence of cannabis?
So what we have ensured, and the Minister of National Security, the Honorable Van Keynes, has assured me that the roadside sobriety equipment for testing would be appropriate for cannabis as well. And so we're actually ahead of the game on that one. And members of the public need to know that the loosening of the reins, my words, in relation to cannabis does not mean that the prohibitions that exist in terms of going to work under the influence, driving under the influence, recreational use in public, all of those prohibitions will continue to exist.
This next question. I have been looking at the government site all week with no form or any place to see where I can give my input. This, of course, is in reference to consultation.
Okay, I can honestly say that I can't answer that question, but I will make a note to have a look and ensure that the vehicle is fit for purpose. But I haven't heard that it's not, so I will ensure that I pass that on to our tech people.
Okay, this next question is in reference to domestic violence. When will we have another government safe house for women of domestic violence?
So what we have right now is a partnership with third sector organizations. So the Center Against Abuse does have resources in that regard. And recently the Bermuda Housing Corporation has reached out to get support with regard to refurbishment of some of their homes, which are going to be used for that purpose. And so it's an issue that's always forefront in domestic situations. And to be quite frank, the Center Against Abuse has been very active in reaching out to the government, and we're looking for synergies to help them better utilize not only their budget, but to really take a look at the prevalence of this particular ailment in our society to make sure that we have the resources and the programs to assist those people.
Hey, the youth have no equity to start businesses like this, and the magnitude, the older citizens in this country have been waiting for legalization, and plus the youth do not appreciate cannabis and its healing properties. This is not about getting high. That's more of a comment. Will there be regulation on pricing, and what regulations on price control will there be in this regime?
That's an interesting question. I had occasion today to have a very lengthy and productive meeting with a group who were doing cannabis research and providing submissions to the government. And that was a question that came up. And there is no intention at this time to put a cap on the pricing with regard to cannabis or any of its products. And we're going to let market forces prevail in that regard. If the person who sent in the question would like to suggest some form of controls or pricing thresholds, then they need to feel free to send that information in for consideration.
And just so our viewers know that it's forum.gov.bm, where they can find the consultation document and able to put their input. So that's forum.gov.bm. Getting back to the questions, they say it takes 15 years before legalized cannabis takes over the black market. How will they be handling any businesses that are not paying taxes?
Business that are not paying taxes?
Paying taxes. Again, I'll repeat the question. Yeah, they say it takes 15 years before legalized cannabis takes over the black market. How will they be handling any businesses that are not paying taxes?
Okay, so are we talking about cannabis related businesses?
That may be operating in the black market.
Okay, there are enforcement measures in place for the black market activity to be addressed. The regulated cannabis scheme will make legal certain activities, and any activities outside of that scheme will continue to be prohibited. And so the enforcement measures, as I said, that currently exist to address that market will continue to be in place. However, and I can't speak to the 15 years, there are components of the cannabis scheme that will not take 15 years for persons to realize some economic gain. As I said earlier, there are products that you can import and sell. There are, I mean, the area, the industry is vast. And so I think I've addressed that question sufficiently.
If one has medicinal cannabis for specific health issues, how will these persons be identified during roadside sobriety or in the workplace? There are products available in the pharmacies that assist with anxiety, inflammation, arthritis, sleep disorders, etc., noting that seniors are also using these products.
Mm-hmm. The original medicinal cannabis scheme actually had an ID card regime. So persons who were prescribed medicinal cannabis by their doctors and were authorized through that prescription to carry the medicinal cannabis were actually going to be issued licenses, as were their caregivers. So as we drill down more into the medicinal cannabis regulatory regime, you'll see these things probably surface.
Has there been any banking alternatives considered? All the local banks with U.S. intermediaries will not bank cannabis businesses, just as they will not bank with casinos.
So we're having that conversation at present, and I'm sure the Minister of Finance and his team will make the necessary outreaches. We are aware of some of the limitations that exist in that regard, and work is going to be undertaken simultaneously as we go through this consultation period to address that.
His viewer can't be the same alcohol test. This is in reference to the earlier question with testing. One stays in system way longer, two different substances. What are they measuring with cannabis in the system?
I am not privy to the technology that's behind the roadside sobriety testing, but what I'll do is reach out to the Minister of National Security, who may be able to shed some light publicly on that aspect of testing.
Just like to remind our viewers that you can we obviously are on the Government of Bermuda Facebook page, our live chat this evening with the Attorney General of Bermuda and Minister of Legal Affairs, Senator the Honorable Kathy Lynn Simmons, JP, who has been taking a series of questions this evening. We will be here with you live until 9 o'clock. I'm Sherry Simmons. A pleasure to have you on board with us this evening. It seems to be that cannabis is the popular topic this evening. Let us just take a break. We certainly will get back to some of those questions, but let's go to a broader overview of some of the other issues that your ministry has been facing over a period of time. One of the things that has been a challenge, and you touched on this a little earlier, was law reform here in Bermuda. What does that mean for the average person?
Law reform for the average person. Basically, what we need to do is modernize our laws. So the body of law that exists in Bermuda should reflect our social values and where we are today as a society. You heard me mention earlier a 1971 Social Welfare Act. So what pertained in 1971 with regard to social services and social welfare was vastly different from what we see in 2020. However, there are instances where we have not progressed and moved forward as a society, and the same issues that systemically have created social problems for our citizens still pertain. So law reform is having an in-depth look at the laws that underpin society to see whether they need to be updated to ensure that they reflect where we are at present. And so, as I said earlier, persons who have a particular interest in any area of law, any regulatory framework in Bermuda should feel free to submit proposals to the Law Reform Commission which breaks down into specialized subcommittees to actually do an in-depth research project with regard to those subjects, and they generate a report to the government, and the government makes a determination as to whether or not they want to move forward with that initiative. Colleagues and I shouldn't say colleagues as if I'm still at work, members of the public may recall they had a family law reform subcommittee some time ago, and out of that came recommendations for a unified family court. That was way back in 2009, I believe, and here we are in 2020, and we don't have a unified family court. And members of the public will recall that that is actually one of the initiatives pre-COVID that was being advanced by the Ministry of Legal Affairs. And so law reform is the systemic review of the laws of Bermuda to ensure that they correctly reflect where we are today as a society.
So is that the overall goal, to have a unified family court in Bermuda?
Absolutely. So what that entails is a separate registry for family court. And the model that we are developing is not just to have a court system, but to encourage alternative dispute resolution for families outside of the court process. So everyone will agree that the court process is extremely intimidating and it breeds conflict in our families. And so other jurisdictions, particularly Trinidad, have developed models that are based on mediation and other social interventions, which allow family disputes to be resolved before they come to the subject of court proceedings. And so the model that we're looking to implement in due course is one that offers services as well as the ultimate recourse of court proceedings. And so in a unified family court, you will have mediation services, you'll have social services. And at the end of the day, if there's alternative dispute resolution vehicles do not work, then you go before the court. So yes, it's still the intention to proceed with that initiative.
Turning back to the questions that are coming in via Facebook, once the legislation is passed, can persons apply for rehabilitation certificates for themselves who have been convicted of cannabis offenses?
So we no longer issue rehabilitation certificates under the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act 1977. And from a practical point of view, imagine going to an employer and showing this certificate to say that you were convicted. The essence of rehabilitation of offenders is that your convictions become spent after 7 years. Okay, so they cease to exist. So we no longer issue certificates.
In the draft, there was a mention that no retail can be within 1 mile of churches. How is this possible on an island with so many churches? Will we have designated areas on an island for retail shops to purchase cannabis, almost a cannabis road?
We won't have a cannabis road, and that is a logistical challenge that we are faced with. And so what you would have to determine is what the market looks like. So for us to say definitively that, well, let's put it this way. I had a group meeting today where there was a suggestion of having retail centralized in specific locations, east, west, and central, yeah, and to have smaller units of retail throughout the parishes. That's very easy to control. The government may, in fact, designate certain areas where you can have retail to the exclusion of others. So as we develop this, and that's a very good point, and it's something that we have actually looked at, in addition to the feasibility of having exclusion zones. Exclusion zones meaning, well, I should call them increased penalty zones. When you look at the number of churches, the number of schools, nurseries and the like, we have to be very careful that we're not limiting activity, but also to ensure that we have the safeguards in place, particularly with the schools, to ensure that we protect that demographic. So it is topical. It is something that's under consideration.
This viewer writes, the U.S. is in a strange predicament where states have legalized cannabis, but it is still federally illegal. Will this affect import, export to the U.S.? Also, the profits cannot be banked due to the federal illegality. Will that be the case in Bermuda?
In terms of export?
Export. How will that impact export?
Yeah, so persons will have to ensure that they're exporting to jurisdictions that they can make that business arrangement with, that don't have the prohibitions that would defeat that exercise.
And for those of you who are joining us, we are live here on Facebook with the Attorney General and Minister of Legal Affairs, Senator the Honorable Kathy Lynn Simmons, JP. We are talking on a number of topics. Number of questions have come in via our viewers on Facebook. Of course, that's the Government of Bermuda Facebook page. Feel free to comment or ask your question. And we are talking primarily, the questions have been primarily about cannabis. Attorney General, was there anything before we get back to some of the questions surrounding cannabis, was there anything that you would like the public to be aware of in general terms of what they need to know, what's happening in your space?
In my space, we are continuing to focus on child safeguarding. We are continuing to make sure that we have transition arrangements in place for our young persons who are aging out of our care homes. Good news, we're revamping our pupillage program. I shouldn't say revamping. Our pupillage program is alive and well. We have 3 positions available for pupillage within the Ministry of Legal Affairs. We've actually had 12 applicants and we've made our selections and we're waiting for confirmation from the Public Service Commission. The success of that program is evident. We have 4 pupils to say all were called to the bar and 3 are actually practicing law. So it's a very successful program that enables us to give young Bermudians the training that they need to succeed in this space. But what's of concern to me is the lack of opportunity for a majority of these young people. We have 12 applicants replacing 3. That means that there are persons whose families have invested tens of thousands of dollars in their education who won't be able to get the necessary training contract to enable them to get called to the bar and actually practice. It is problematic. So what we're doing is looking to see if we can actually place these persons in other positions throughout the government to enable them to not only earn a living, but to eventually be able to practice at the bar. So we're keeping our finger on that. One of the things that's apparent to me is that the government still continues to outsource legal matters where necessary, particularly in very specialized areas where we don't practice in the Attorney General's chambers, and we spend a considerable amount of money on those external services. So what we're trying to do is partner our young people with those external firms to at least make sure they're getting exposure they need to increase their experience. And hopefully on the next round, there'll be our next tranche of pupils.
AG, we're still getting a number of questions on the taxation aspect of cannabis. That is something that you addressed earlier in our conversation. But just for the edification of those who are just joining us, and there are a number of questions that have been asked about that, what will taxation look like surrounding the cannabis regime? Taxation?
Obviously, the revenue that's generated by the government in relation to payroll tax and the like that is associated with normal business activity will pertain. If the question is whether the government is actually going to tax profits, that's something that we're looking at very closely as we look at the wider economic scope of how this scheme is actually going to benefit the government as well as the citizens of Bermuda. So everything is on the table, and I'm sure we've heard that phrase in terms of the economic scenery of Bermuda, but everything literally is on the table when it comes to cannabis. And so as we continue to develop the regime, more of the economic profile associated with the regulatory regime will be put in the public domain.
This viewer writing, can I import CBD oil and products?
Absolutely.
And that has been the case for some time.
Yeah.
Streaming down now, looking at a number of questions again surrounding cannabis.
Cannabis again.
Yeah. Just want to make sure that we are getting all of the questions, because that certainly seems to be the topic of most interested. Folks are most interested in this evening. Let's talk a little bit about going back to the changes in legislation and the overall modernization of legislation historically.
Mhm. What you can expect is that this will be an active topic of discussion with the government. Incidents such as those in the United States bring to the fore the importance of making sure that we keep our finger on the pulse and not only continue to protest and talk about it, but to actually do something about it. And so an assessment as to the Bermuda scene with regard to racism needs to be undertaken in a real way. I mean, this is something that, you know, governments haven't had the courage in the past, and no slight intended, to delve into. And as a result of that, the same social conditions that and economic conditions that breed what we call a systemic racist system continue to pertain. And so I would I would say that it's high time we put this at the top of the list and sit down and drill down in terms of what legal framework we need to put in place to assist our citizens to get a more equitable share in a whole lot of aspects of Bermuda life. We have the economic disparity, we have social disparity, we have educational disparity, and even the cursory review of the Workforce Equity Act that I undertook last week really hit home to me that we actually need to make this a priority. And I know I can speak for the Premier in saying that it actually is going to be a priority of this government. And so, perversely, the incident that we're all deeply hurt by and concerned about in the United States is coming to our shores with different issues, which I won't go into at this particular time, but know that this is a live issue.
This viewer writing, yes, the language needs to change in the law. This is in reference to the modernization of law.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the wording needs to be more inclusive and more modern.
Mm-hmm. So what we do when we draft legislation at present is we also make sure that it's gender neutral. The drafting tool is such that plain English is the benchmark because our audience needs to be able to understand the rules that regulate their behavior and otherwise. And so we do have a modern drafting tool that takes into consideration the language that's appropriate for 2020.
This viewer asking a question that is bouncing off of the earlier issue of the rehabilitation certificate that you addressed earlier. To the Attorney General's answer regarding the rehabilitation certificate, there are those employers who have this on employment applications. Have you been incarcerated? If the answer is yes, then this poses a problem with discrimination. How will the government address this aspect?
So I'd like to thank that member of the public for bringing that to our attention. And as we look at workforce equity, this will be something that we will address. This should not be something that appears on application forms. However, if it does, the person who has a spent conviction has a different approach to it. So suffice it to say, we now have a new Minister of Labor, and we will be looking at labor practices holistically going forward. So everything's in the pot together. And I'll go back to my previous phrase that's been used by my colleagues, everything is on the table. And so it does us good for members of the public to bring certain things to our attention. So I encourage that member of the public to write in to the Minister of Labor so that these things can be addressed. But I'm happy to make a note of it for my own edification and research.
This viewer asking, will there be financial assistance programs or grants for locals who wish to start a cannabis business?
So we have the Bermuda Economic Development Corporation, and that is the vehicle through which we're able to provide assistance for startups. And what the intention is to partner with them to ensure that there are educational programs for entrepreneurs as well as startup funding. And that's something that we're going to be looking into in the very near future. So people can stay tuned to see what support looks like in this space.
This is a comment in reference to cannabis. I hope the government won't allow big corporations in here for the cannabis industry. Our people are smart enough to deal with this.
Mm-hmm. So when we talk about big corporations, I draw everyone's attention back to the different types of licenses and the different types of businesses that will be undertaken through those licenses. And so where we have scientific research, and particularly with regard to medicinal cannabis, there is scope for expertise to be able to assist us in trying to corner that market. I spoke in the Senate some time ago about developing a Bermuda strain. And so we will look to see, what we need to collaborate on. But I can say this much, Sherry, we have people in the country right now who are experts in many aspects of cannabis. And so we're hoping to grow a homegrown market in the first instance. I understand the 1% fear, and that's something that is at the forefront of our policy development in this area.
This viewer would like to know, will duty to restaurants having duty relief for equipment and dry goods?
That is on the cards for consideration.
This viewer says, is this true? Wishes to know if this is true. If Bermuda legalizes cannabis, U.S. immigration will leave and we will have to clear customs in the U.S. instead of being here being, is it still a federal offense in the U.S.? So they're concerned that if there is legalization of cannabis, that the U.S. immigration will leave the island.
I have not had information from the Minister of National Security with regard to any change in border controls or immigration pre-clearance as a result of legalization. And I would say ours, a regulated cannabis market being developed in Bermuda.
Are there any concerns that you are hearing surrounding the legalization of cannabis as you go about your daily life? Are you hearing any general concerns? Certainly, we've heard a lot from the market standpoint. Lots of folks are asking about opportunities. So it does sound like there are hundreds, if not thousands, of Bermudians who are interested in the economic empowerment aspect. Putting that aside for a moment, have you heard any concerns regarding the social aspect of legalization?
Absolutely. Not everyone is in favor of the recreational use of cannabis to the extent that that recreational use may take place in public or may be undertaken by a neighbor and affect their quality of life as a nearby tenant. There are concerns that have been raised from the outset by the Ministry of Health, which we aim to address by striking the necessary balance with the safeguards that we put in place. This is a new area, but an old area to the extent that the use of marijuana has been in Bermuda for many years. It's historic. And what we're trying to do is encourage people to look at the plant differently. It has huge medicinal qualities. It's been used in religious ceremony in Bermuda in a way that's not offensive to anyone. And so as we look at a regulatory regime, we're trying to take into account all of the different demographics and interests that we as a government have to cater to. And so it's a balancing act that is delicate. However, I can honestly say the energy that's been generated in this country by this proposal is immense. And it speaks to the lack of economic activity which the average person has been able to engage in, that we need to ensure is always available. So you will know our two pillars, economic empowerment through IB is not for all of us, okay? Economic empowerment through the tourist industry, some may argue is very limited. And so here we have a new tool to advance some economic gain in the country for the average person. And so the energy that's been generated around this is immense and is actually welcome. But I'll revert back to saying that it is a balancing act. And so a regulatory regime will take into consideration the various components of what we need to do as a country to make sure that everyone's interests are protected as best we can.
So would appear, certainly this is not the first public consultation period for a major issue here in Bermuda, but judging by the feedback that you have been getting and your colleagues have been getting, it would appear that this has generated a level of interest that perhaps other consultative periods has not.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, we did consultation on the medicinal piece. There was virtually no feedback, and people generally were not even interested in that aspect of it. All they want to know is when we're going to legalize cannabis. And so, as responsive to the people that we are, we've gone down a road that I think is going to benefit the community.
They're responding in your answer, saying you're being responsive to what the community is calling for. There are members of the community that are fearful that the government is responding to the wrong voices and you're just giving people what they want, and it isn't necessarily the best thing for our community overall. What would you say to that?
There is no wrong voice. There is no wrong voice. We all have a voice. And I think it's important that people make sure that their voices are heard as we go through this consultation period. What is the wrong voice? The young people who want economic empowerment, the disenfranchised business owners who are looking for a way to pivot so that they can support their families. There is no wrong voice. There are voices of a collective that are very concerned that they need to be able to eat in this country. And so to the extent that the government is offering an economic vehicle that will permit that, there is no wrong voice. And so persons who don't support this regime have the opportunity through the consultation period to voice their concerns. But what we do is we try to, as I said earlier, balance the diverse interests and concerns to make sure that we have a scheme that everyone can live with. But as in any regulatory regime, as in any initiative, legislative or otherwise, you will have your supporters and you'll have your detractors. But I think the overarching good and benefit in this regime will override the government's concern with regard to the detractors.
Is there a limit on weight for importation for a licensed retail store?
We haven't gotten down to the specifics of that in terms of putting that out in the public domain. What we're trying not to do is thwart general market forces. And so a regulated cannabis market does not mean an over-regulated scheme. And so what we're trying to do is make sure we focus regulation on the aspects of a cannabis regime that are necessary to create the balance that I spoke of earlier. But in terms of limiting the scope of the economic activity, we're not down in the weeds that far yet. And I don't think we're going to over-regulate at this stage.
There's still a number of questions coming in terms of the banking aspect. And I know that you have addressed this, but certainly there are viewers who are just joining us and they perhaps may have missed that aspect of the conversation. So if we revert back to the banking, as everyone knows, there has been difficulty with cannabis businesses being banked, much like casino businesses being banked. How is that aspect of the situation being addressed?
In the same manner that the government had to address this with regard to casino gaming, the outreach to the banks will be undertaken with various options being presented for their consideration. I would like to think that at this stage in our development, the banks will be in support of the economic activity in the country as much as the government is. And so in any economic scheme going forward, we're looking for the banks to be equal partners with us in ensuring that this scheme comes to fruition to benefit the people of Bermuda. So that dialogue will take place and will be continuous. And I will report in to members of the public as we make headway along that road.
What do members of the public, particularly those who are with us live now and are expressing keen interest in getting involved in the economic aspect of the cannabis regime, what do folks need to be doing right now to prepare themselves for this eventual change?
Research. Number one, make sure that you research your products, that you have a business plan, and that you avail yourselves of the assistance, if necessary, that the Bermuda Economic Development Corporation is offering. So it's all in preparation. I think the public will have the benefit of the framework of the scheme, so you know where we're going. What we're trying to do is really finalize the regulatory regime. But what's more important is for the public not to focus overly on their own personal business aspects, but to make sure that they feed in so that what we end up at the end of the day is a scheme that's going to enable them to realize their business aspirations. So don't sit outside the equation. Make sure that your voice is heard. If you are totally satisfied by the proposed scheme, that's fine. But at this stage of the game, you should be looking at what products you want to bring in. I mean, what's your business model? You can see the different types of licenses that are being proposed. And so it's all in the preparation. The persons are encouraged to drill down, do the research, look at the economics of it, look at where their needs lie in terms of starting up a business. I think interested persons may be interested in banding together to form their own companies. I mean, there's always power in numbers. So there are any number of reiterations that are available to Bermudians to try to take advantage of what we're presenting as a commercial option.
There's still a number of questions coming in reference to the personal cultivation aspect of cannabis. A number of folks mentioning that in other jurisdictions elsewhere, you can have X number of plants. If you can just touch on that, I know that we have discussed that because that is one of the more frequently asked questions. Can you just let folks know why that is currently not the case?
Okay, so in a previous reiteration of the proposal, we did have personal cultivation licenses, and we call those Class A licenses. And when we looked at, because remember, nothing exists in isolation from the rest of the scheme. And so when we talk about a regulated cannabis market, inherent in that is a level of enforcement to ensure that people follow the rules. And so in considering the balance with the well-being of our young people, and also the enforcement measures that would be necessary to ensure that your 3 plants for personal use didn't turn into 350, a decision was made that it may not be as feasible at this stage to go that route. However, members of the public should make their interest in this class of license known. And I'm taking note that it is something that we have to go back and revisit. Again, when we talk about personal responsibility, we talk about people ensuring that they follow the rules. We're not looking to see a Class A personal cultivation license turn into a de facto commercial enterprise because people aren't following the rules, and enforcement takes on another complexion because we're then having to go into people's backyards to see what happened to the 3 plants, or we're getting a report from neighbor number 2 that there are 350 as opposed to 3. Yeah. And so I would say that personal cultivation licenses are not off the table, and people should register their interest in this category of license being put back into the scheme so that Cabinet can further consider it.
This viewer writing, legalization will raise the supply and lower the cost greatly. The black market will be crippled and the economy will suffer. Has any thought been given to what the devaluation of marijuana will do to the economy?
We are satisfied and hopeful that the different levels of activity that can take place around cannabis will not result in devaluation. And so when you look at the classes of licenses, when you look at even the occasional licenses that we may evolve to granting for special events, when we look at, the tourist product eventually, when we look at the capacity to export, the possibilities are endless. So this is a situation where you almost wait and see. So if people have specific concerns based on data that they want to submit for our consideration in terms of the economic piece, then feel free to do so.
We are continuing our discussion, our live Facebook discussion with the Attorney General and Minister of Legal Affairs, Senator the Honorable Kathy Lynn Simmons, JP. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening, and keep those questions coming in. This listener writing, will there be public hall meetings on this?
Well, in COVID land, it's very difficult to have a public meeting. So we've been discussing social distancing at a public meeting, but the level of interest that's been generated by this subject would make it necessary for me to probably have one every week. And so we do want to directly engage with members of the public. So yes, I will say that we do intend to have public meetings, some in person, some via WebEx. And as the scheme evolves, we'll have more information to share with the public. I would suggest that they watch the online forum very closely, because we will be posting more information as we go along. And as I said, the draft legislation may actually evolve to a certain extent. So yes, we do intend to have public outreach. We have church groups that need to have a voice. We have religious groups that need to have a voice. We have young people who need to have a voice. We have persons engaged in the illicit trade who need to have a voice. And so this is a community initiative. So everyone needs to weigh in. So yes, we will be hitting the road with cannabis.
On the issue of persons who are currently involved in the illicit trade of cannabis, will there be anything done if you come forward, if you've been selling marijuana illegally all of this time and you wish to make it a legitimate business? Will you be punished when you come forward to express your interest for that? Will that be held against you? Will people assume from a policing standpoint and from a government standpoint that, oh, this person, we're going to hold it against them that they had been breaking the law up until this point?
Absolutely not. Everyone is entitled to a fresh start. There's no one who should be reluctant to come forward and participate in the scheme or have their say. This is not an exclusive man's domain. This is for everyone to weigh in who wishes to weigh in and to be a part of it. We're not here to be judge and jury of anyone. That would preclude all of our social justice initiatives and our general premise for trying to encourage, legitimize economic activity in the country. Understanding the genesis of this was to prevent decriminalization of our young Black man. So if there is a young Black man out there who wishes to ensure that he's able to apply for one of the licenses that is in our proposal, then he is more than welcome to apply like everyone else. I think the policy specifically says that people will not be penalized for past activity. That's the whole premise underlying the expungement of convictions and the like. And so I encourage persons who are in the Black market to legitimize their activity through our regulated cannabis market scheme.
Has there been any projection in terms of how much this could mean for the overall community from a financial standpoint? If you have X number of people who are given licenses, who apply for them and they receive licenses, what does this mean in real dollar terms for economic empowerment?
In real dollar terms, it depends on the market, it depends on the product. And so there's an assumption that we're talking about one type of marijuana product. The industry is diverse, and so it's almost impossible at this stage to calculate. Now, the group I met with today made projections with regard to a government-run cannabis industry, and the projected income was huge. It was a very interesting concept. And we have yet to determine whether the government is going to actually have a role in any of this. That conversation is ongoing. It's impossible, Sherry, for us to do those projections. When you talk about market forces, we can do estimates if this is the case or that's the case. But when we talk about home industry, when we talk about larger commercial industry, when we talk about export for commercial purposes, it's huge. And so as we collect data along the way, as we see the interest in actually applying for the licenses, it's one thing to be interested, it's another thing to connect the dots and set up a business model that enables you to take advantage of this. And understand, your business may be making edibles from home. Your business may be having a retail shop. Your business may be commercial cultivation for export. Your business may be transport and security. And so it depends on what aspect of the market you're talking about. But no, we haven't done the projections.
This viewer wondering, will a percentage of cannabis be tested for pests, molds, etc., also for percentage of THC and CBD. In other jurisdictions, they test 1% of plants cultivated.
We are intending to do testing to make sure that the product is pure enough to be sold. We have government analysts that will be brought on board to assist, and the requisite equipment used for that purpose. Obviously, things that are imported that are already approved, don't go through that, but at a customs entry point, there will be the requirements at that end.
What should the general public really take to heart when it comes to these proposed changes, and knowing that it will change, albeit it's the draft legislation right now, but there will be major changes surrounding cannabis laws in Bermuda? What do you want folks to understand, that what these changes in law, what it doesn't mean?
What it doesn't mean.
What it does mean.
What it doesn't mean. What it doesn't mean is that you cannot drive under the influence. You cannot go to school under the influence. You cannot engage in public. Okay, so the prohibitions that exist, and I'll give you the alignment to alcohol consumption, will pertain to cannabis use. Yes, and so there are things that will be prohibited, and the scheme will set out very clearly what is allowed and the rules for the permissions that are granted through the license and the like.
Getting back, this is a question that is in alignment with taxation, understanding that the taxation regime surrounding cannabis has not been fully fleshed out as of yet. But will there be funds? Is there any intention for any funds that come through the cannabis industry to be used towards social programs, whether it be rehabilitation, education, etc.?
Yeah, absolutely. So the National Drug Control Department has a huge mandate when it comes to education of the various drugs. And so they will be requested to develop a program, an educational program, and funding will be aligned to an education that is necessary, particularly in our schools. I think that we need to increase the education component across the board, period, with alcohol, with cannabis, with tobacco. And so resources will be applied through this industry to ensure that that education component is as it should be.
This viewer writing, we must think holistically about this. We allow alcohol in homes with babies and teens. And this was in I believe, a comment in reference to personal cultivation.
Yeah, and that's always the challenge. So right now our regime has used at 21, and there's been much discussion about lowering the consumption age to 18. And that was prepared to for all the health reasons. And then the argument was raised, well, why not raise the alcohol consumption age to 21? Yeah, these are issues that persons are invited to weigh in on. So when you look at the proposal and you see the age limitation, please let your voice be heard in terms of your views with regard to that.
This viewer having the suggestion to tell the people to hold some of their pension money and pool it together.
The possibilities are endless. The possibilities are endless, yeah.
Cooperative, speaking of pooling money together, cooperative economics has been something that the Bermuda government has touched on. Can you just give us an idea of what that would mean for the people of Bermuda, understanding that this is not, and I understand that this is not under your purview, it's not your ministry, but that is something that the Premier has certainly touched on throughout the years, and members of your colleagues have touched on it as well. Where is cooperative / economic empowerment, particularly for, quite frankly, the Black community? Where is that on the agenda of the Bermuda government?
In terms of the cannabis regime or generally?
Yeah, well, that, and also looking at it from an expanded, not just cannabis, but expanded economic opportunity.
So
or
yeah, thanks for that, Sherry. As we look to expand economic activity, it's hopeful that new industry will grow up. When it comes to cannabis, there are any number of activities surrounding the cannabis industry that government may wish to partner privately with our citizens in respect of. Now, the cooperative would mean that ownership of any particular economic enterprise pertaining to cannabis would be shared between the government and its citizens. I mean, with regard to the medicinal cannabis, there was a thought that maybe the research component could be shared. There's also the export component if we decide that we're going to do, say, the Bermuda brand. Yeah. So as we go down the road of developing, if and when the government intends to play a role in this regime, the opportunities for cooperatives with our citizens are endless. But that model, particularly when it comes to our essential services, is something that I think that the government will embrace going forward. But again, this is a time when we have to be creative about economic activity in the country, and determine what industry looks like going forward. We don't have our own insurance company. We don't have, our own bank. And so these are things that we need to consider in terms of development. I'm not speaking out of turn for the government. I'm just saying that that's a model that would definitely benefit our people if the right economic vehicle is identified.
As we go forward, we still have a few moments left. Now the time is 8:45, 15 minutes left. We will be wrapping things at 9 o'clock. So certainly to the public, thank you for joining us. Please, we still have time to take your questions. And certainly if you have a question on another topic, we have spent a great deal of time with questions on the cannabis regime, and certainly happy to entertain those questions, but want you to know that if you have any other questions surrounding the role of the Attorney General or anything that falls within her ministry, certainly feel free to get them to us in the next 13 or 14 minutes, as we are with our Facebook Live edition of Ask the Attorney General and Minister of Legal Affairs, Senator the Honorable Kathy Lynn Simmons, who has been joining us this evening since around 7:30. So what can we expect coming out of the Attorney General's office in the next weeks, months, and years to come? An overview. I know that's an overview. A pretty general question.
Yeah.
But some of the key things that are on the top of your agenda, your ministry's agenda, and the public can look forward to seeing.
Yeah, I have been fortunate enough to be assigned a very diverse ministry. So we have the legal component, which is the Attorney General's chambers, where we provide the legal advice. And what we're trying to do is ensure that we provide I would call it client care, so that our various departments understand the legislation underpinning their initiatives. What we're also trying to do is build capacity within the civil service. So as the business of government becomes more complex, it's essential that we ensure that our skills are commensurate with what we're required to deliver. And so the training component and the building of capacity within the service is going to be a priority for me. I will always take exception to the farming out of legal matters. And so I need to have a team that is able to basically spread the wings a little bit wider. We have an excellent team led by the Solicitor General, Melvin Douglas. We have the Deputy Solicitor General, Shakira Francois Deal, and they continue to provide services to the government and to try to expand our capacity through the council that they have on their team. We have a drafting section, legislative drafters, or parliamentary council as we call them, who have done a yeoman's job in churning out legislation during this COVID period. In terms of our pupillage program, we have pupils that will go through all of the different departments in the ministry, particularly the DPP's office for prosecution experience. They will go down to legal aid, and they will learn to draft legislation to the extent that time allows, and they will provide civil advice and learn litigation skills as well. So we build capacity as our young people come in, but we will continue to try to streamline and modernize our processes. We will continue to ensure that our child safeguarding initiatives are in alignment with international best practice. And that is a wide open area that we are going to be spending a lot of time on going forward. I have a child safeguarding committee that is established under the Child Safeguarding Miscellaneous Amendments Act that we enacted last year, and they will be very busy ensuring that they have the framework necessary to protect our children. We definitely are in the midst of modernizing our processes underlying the grant of liquor licensing. Online applications in the card. We see that COVID has made us look more closely at the licenses that are necessary to be granted to expand services in that area. So we have Mark Daniels, who is our barrister, but he's also our chairman at the helm of the Liquor Licensing Authority, and his team, who are really, really doing some good work in drilling down in terms of modernizing the activities surrounding that. So we have different boards and committees that are very active at this time that need to be better supported, in my humble opinion. And so we're looking at what models can make it more efficient and less labor intense. We have a child placement board underneath the Children Act 1998 that needs to be revamped, which is responsible for oversight of our children in care. And so I say all that to say, my law reform is a review of the legislation that underpins the operations of the ministry to make sure that it's suitable for the times that we're in. There is a huge, how can I put this? Our social welfare and social issues have not changed through times. And so what we're doing is trying to look at the systemic issues that have us sitting squarely in this place, of dysfunction in our families. And you will see a lot of activity on the social front coming out of our ministry. That's a snapshot overview.
When you say that a number of our issues that we are facing as a community have not changed over successive decades, many would say that's a failure of successive administrations, not just the Progressive Labor Party administration, not just the current administration, but the UBP, the OBA, any other administration that has sat at the helm, that's a failure of government to address those issues.
Well, it's a failure of the community to have honest conversations about where we need to be in terms of our social landscape. When you have socioeconomic issues that are generational, they're very difficult to defeat. And what we do is we offer services. And we now need to look at the effectiveness of those services to see whether they're actually properly aligned with the needs. And so when you look at our social services landscape, we have any number of charities that are providing services to that demographic, and the effectiveness of the services needs to be really looked at. Likewise, we look at DCFS to make sure that the services that we are offering are fit for purpose. And I'm happy to say that as we continue to service our families, we look to find even better mechanisms to get the desired outcomes. But there's a huge responsibility that the community itself has to undertake to support our families. Government cannot do everything. Government is in partnership with the community. So to say there's been a failure of successive administrations in terms of us putting a framework in place that is nimble enough to address the various needs, so be it. However, we are famous for enacting legislation that does not, and when I say we, I've inherited legislation that's simply not fit for purpose. And so we're so busy with the business of governance that we sometimes don't reach back and pause and do the monitoring and assessment that's necessary to make sure that our vehicles are fit for purpose. So we're going to be moving forward. And as the Premier always says, we have an opportunity to write the script for the future. And so that's the approach that I'm taking. Let's dial back. We've had almost 3 years of very challenging times, but we have a starting team. We have workers at DCFS who are there for our children and our families, regardless of the negativity, regardless of the challenges. And we try to do better every day. And under the oversight of the Director of Child and Family Services, it's a living, ongoing thing. Every day is a new day to do better. And so I'm very pleased with the resilience of that team, which segues me into questions that have arisen with regard to the homeless shelter. Yes. And I believe there was some questioning about the leadership in terms of whose responsibility is that. And so I just wanted to make it clear to members of the public that under the EMO banner, the Director of Child and Family Services is the linchpin for shelters. And it just so happens in this pandemic, we've had a more permanent shelter because our pandemic is longer than, say, a hurricane, and also because we've had curfews. And so that is not a DCFS function. Persons need to be clear on that. But Mr. Mabry is actually the head of shelters generally in emergency situations. So the staff at DCFS have done a sterling job, those who have been resourced to assist with the shelter. But of course, as we return back to our normal operations, we have to ensure that that demographic is properly serviced going forward. So under the banner of our new social services, that will actually be a focus, making sure that they have the infrastructure where they too can thrive along with everybody else that we're servicing.
We are 5 minutes away from our closing time of 9 o'clock, and I will get back to, we have another question coming in
Cannabis.
Regarding cannabis.
Okay. We're going to have a separate cannabis forum going forward. So we'll revisit Facebook Live again on that one. I'm sorry, Sherry, go ahead.
And this will be our final question. The question is, was medicinal cannabis removed from, cannabis removed from the legislation, and what provisions does the AG foresee for medical patients?
What provisions we foresee that we'll have the medicinal cannabis regime under. So we had a free speech mandate for cultivation of medicinal cannabis. And what we now have is a general cultivation for commercial purposes license that could include medicinal cannabis. And so it has not been put in the legislation or draft legislation as a standout or standalone regime, but there is scope for it to be incorporated in the present regime. So as we further refine the legislation and the underlying policy, all of the different components will be taken into account. So I said earlier that there will be regulations that speak just to the medicinal cannabis regime. So as we further develop the legislation, persons should stay tuned. So we will be earmarking the different segments, and as we go along the consultation process, obviously, we'll be highlighting the different aspects of the cannabis market regime.
And as we wrap things up, I'd like to thank those members of the public who have joined us this evening. Certainly a big thank you to the Attorney General and Minister of Legal Affairs, Senator the Honorable Kathy Lynn Simmons, JP, for joining us this evening on this live Facebook chat of Ask the Attorney General. And as she's indicated, within earshot of thousands of people here in Bermuda, that we will do this again, and perhaps looking at a separate discussion that is just dealing with cannabis in and of itself, given the interest, the level of interest that is happening. Now, as we wrap things up, Attorney General, particularly on the issue of the consultation for the cannabis regime, what would you like to remind the public of?
I would like to remind the public to ensure that they give us the feedback that is necessary to advance the finalization of the scheme through the government portal. It's very important that you weigh in and give your views. I don't want to have the narrative after the fact that this was missed or we feel a certain way. This is your opportunity to help us develop and form this regime for Bermuda. So I encourage all of you to please let your views be known. I receive personal emails daily. I've asked those questions to make sure they forward those into the forum. So to Bermuda, to everyone who's interested in this regime, please let your views be known. This is your opportunity to help us create. And it's a Bermuda initiative. And so Bermuda needs to weigh in.
And you can do so at forum.gov.bm. And this comment is what we will end the evening on. This listener, I'm so used to doing radio, this viewer, this viewer commenting, I hope all of us Bermudians benefit from this, not just some. None of us deserve just the crumbs.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Attorney General, for joining us, and thank you to everyone who participated this evening. We certainly do wish you all the best this evening. And remember, folks, particularly if you will be participating in any of the public gatherings that are scheduled over the next, over this weekend, remember social distancing, you still need your mask, and stay safe. Thank you again, Attorney General, for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Sherry.
Good night.
Good night.